Hello, I'm John Hartnett, a sort of retired Episcopal priest, and this is the next in a series of reflections on lessons appointed by the Lectionary for the reading on Sundays. Today I'm reading from the Gospel appointed for September the 1st, Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 23, with some verses left out by the Lectionary. I'll comment on that as we go along. Here it begins. Now, when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" He said to them, "Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition.'" And here's one of the skipping sections, and he picks up again in verse 14. "Then he called the crowd again and said to them, 'Listen to me, all of you who understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile.'" Skipping another section, picking it up at verse 21. For it is from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. The word of the Lord. Well, the question I think this lesson addresses, among others, is what corrupts a life? Is it something external or something inherently inside a person? The classical Jewish tradition is that some foods are unclean. What might make them unclean is not the issue. They are simply not to be consumed. And there are other regulations, codes of conduct about what is permitted, what is healthy, and what is not. The Pharisees, a party of the Jews who sought to foster good lives through obedience, see Jesus' followers washing with defiled hands, and they take Jesus to task for it. Now, I confess to being sympathetic to Pharisees. Not only about hand washing before eating, but also about, say, scrubbing before going into the operating room. There are things out there which really do need to be washed away. Most of us don't view foods as unclean, and maybe think it's primitive to have such categories. But are cigarettes clean? What about high sugar, high fat, high salt, heavily processed foods? Are they clean? What about alcohol? What about street drugs? Is marijuana harmless, or something it might be prudent to avoid? Before we scoff at the Pharisees and their disapproval of unclean behavior, we might consider our own attitudes. And what about what we take in which is not food? I remember, for example, when in television and films, most black characters were either servants, comical, or criminal. I remember an era when Hispanic men were most commonly portrayed as drug dealers, and more recently when most Muslims were presented as terrorists. And of course, then there's how women have been presented in TV and film. More recently, there's been a movement to ban some books from libraries which espouse views considered toxic by those who seek to keep those books off the shelves and away from young readers. While groups might seriously disagree about what publications are destructive or toxic, many would find that some are beyond the limit of what should be consumed. Think of a crime or behavior you consider particularly despicable or evil, and ask what should be done with a novel or a film which celebrates that behavior and presents it as an attractive choice. Censorship seems like a bad answer, but how might one address what truly defiles? And do we even agree on what defile means in this context? Now, so far, I might be leaning towards the Pharisees. It might seem that ignoring a little thing like accepted customs and practices about eating might be trivial, but little transgressions have a way of growing into and undermining the general purpose that restrictions may have for making life healthy. The first time I read a now common four-letter Anglo-Saxon word for sexual activity in the New Yorker, I did not find it exhilarating or liberating. I frankly felt a sense of loss and foreboding that the intervening years have only confirmed. Not long ago, I heard a speaker use the same word in a church from the pulpit, and I had the mental response of the Pharisees. How is it that we have given up the traditions of the elders? Is the world a better place because there are fewer and fewer things which are, not to be published or publicly declared? And let me dig the hole a little bit deeper. In our reading from Deuteronomy this morning, which was chapter 4, verses 1 through 9, I didn't read it in our session, but it's there if you want to check. It's Moses talking about the Ten Commandments. And Moses says, having given the Ten Commandments to the people in the wilderness, he says, "You must neither add anything to what I command you, nor take anything away from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God, with which I am charging you." Moses is a strict construction originalist. You must neither add nor subtract from the commandments. They are not guiding principles to sort of shape you as you think and devise future policies, but they are actually literal commandments, he says. In this conversation between the Pharisees and Jesus, on which side might the authority of Moses fall? It turns out that the Pharisees have their own workarounds for what pinches their lifestyle. In a section that the lectionary that we just read skips over, but very much in the original text, Jesus rebukes the Pharisees after their accusation of his disciples, and he says to them, You Pharisees, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition. For Moses said, Honor your father and your mother, and whoever speaks evil of father or mother must surely die. But you say that if anyone tells father or mother, whatever support you might have had from me is korban, that is, an offering to God, then you no longer permit doing anything for a father or mother, thus making void the word of God through your tradition that you have handed on. And you do many things like this. Basically, Jesus is saying you can get around your obligations by setting up a restricted charitable trust and naming yourself as the lifetime beneficiary. It turns out that the strict constructionist Pharisees can become significantly more flexible in creating legal fictions when it suits their desires. Now, there is nothing wrong with the law, but the law is only as good or as pure as the one who practices it. If one wants to get around the law, it seems, one will find a way. Now, there is an irony in the life of the church with this. There are lots of ironies in the life of the church, but this one is that the Episcopal Church, has responded to the sexual misconduct problem with regular mandatory training sessions for clergy, which reiterate the law and its authority, but actually do little to address the sources of behavior which seek to subvert it. They do, however, and this was, I thought very helpful, identify something called the exception fantasy. The exception fantasy is, I know what I am proposing to do or thinking about doing or have done is wrong, but this is different. We are in different circumstances, and therefore what would be wrong otherwise is okay because we really love each other, or I'm really helping this person, or we all have agreed to do this, whatever. It's the exception fantasy. And that says the law is there, but it doesn't really apply to me. I've come up with a means within myself to say that this doesn't really apply. Why does Jesus take issue with the Pharisees and their methodology? Jesus' contention, perhaps not original to him, is that there is something in our fundamental nature which makes us prone to disobedience, prone to becoming defiled, and striving for or imposing by threat or penalty scrupulous external compliance with the law leaves that deeper and more powerful motivation unaddressed. Mandatory training is not sufficient. One of my colleagues from another diocese who attended these regular with me is, I believe, in the middle of a 7 to 20-year term for what he was convicted of doing. And this was all, this is someone who attended all the mandatory training. In the Garden of Eden, did the serpent compel Adam and Eve to ignore what God had commanded? The serpent simply opened the door, and Adam and Eve both, thinking that they were stepping into freedom, walked from paradise into death. The serpent may have accessed or even activated what defiled them, but he did not impart it. It was already there. Perhaps that sense of our innate propensity to rebellion and disobedience, which ironically is not self-serving, but ultimately self-defiling, is what lies behind Jesus giving so much valuable airtime in his very short prayer to the phrase, "Lead us not into temptation." Frankly, I wonder why he didn't say, "When we find ourselves in temptation, powerfully and effectively pull us out." Somehow it seems to be that the cultivating of the ability to discern and resist what defiles better shapes our character than simply never being exposed in the first place. I wonder if what would give us better lives is not simply complying with the law, or at least not getting caught transgressing it, but changing that aspect of ourselves which wants to rebel, to choose for itself. What might me think, what might make me believe that obedience to God produces a better result than choosing what I think is best? Obedience to the wrong thing or person can be seriously defiling. "I was just following orders" has proven to be an inadequate defense or justification for defiling behavior. Perhaps the only real freedom we have is the freedom to choose whom we will follow, ourselves in the moment, or something, or someone else. Whom do you follow, and why? If God is not the answer, and if we're honest, I suspect it is the answer for few of us, then why is that the case? If our image of God is that God's will is restrictive and keeps us from the best lives we could have, or that God's will may be good about some things, helping the poor, for example, but more problematic about others, pretty much anything to do with sex these days, then the temptation is to pick and to choose. Bishop Robert Barron in his church calls this behavior being a cafeteria Catholic. This behavior puts our will, our judgment, at the top and places God as a subsidiary resource, a wise voice whom we might consult and take seriously, but might not always accept if we think it doesn't really make sense this time. There is always the exception fantasy. This is different. This approach puts us among the Pharisees, alas, not among the disciples. Well, what has this to do with eating with unwashed hands? I think Jesus' point is that to address the risk of defilement, simply looking outside of ourselves will not be an effective strategy. When we believe that we are inherently good and pure and that evil is outside of us, another party, another race, another culture, another whatever, when we believe that evil is outside of us, then the temptation is great to blame what is outside of us, whether a substance, a person, a group, a party, an ethnic group, or whatever. The temptation is great to blame them for whatever is amiss in the world or in our lives. The goal, instead of blaming, might be to heal and to reform and to repair what is actually amiss within us. It's something like seeking vaccination. That is to say, to acquire the ability to resist whatever comes our way, because keeping ourselves always free from corrupting factors seems unlikely. There may be a place for masks and hand sanitizers and all of that, but robust antibodies might be a more reliable supporter of health. So the street drug problem may not be so much about drugs as it is our propensity to think that using drugs will be a shortcut to something else that we really want. The drug trade would disappear tomorrow if everyone stopped buying and using drugs. What if the war on drugs were more about addressing issues of despair and sources of hope and relief, or even escape, than about armed agents in Kevlar vest kicking in doors? What if what corrupts us is not outside of us, but what is within? Or, as Jesus puts it, for it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come. Fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evils come within, and they defile a person. End of quote. It's a pretty daunting list, isn't it? So, rather than calling out Jesus' disciples, the Pharisees might have done better to ask themselves how they, that day, had fallen short of what God expected of them. The challenge before us is how to address evil in the world, which generally defiles a person, a community, or a culture, without becoming self-righteous, without putting ourselves in the place of God. To be brave, but also to be humble, to address what defiles, but also to recognize what Jesus calls the evil intentions which we have in our own hearts. That is the challenge before us. In today's gospel, we see two groups seeking to live and to grow into faithful lives, the disciples and the Pharisees. To which group do you wish to belong? What do you think defiles a life, a community, or a culture? And what might we do to promote greater health? Thank you.